Nu metal was once seen as an undesirable genre. After all, this subgenre that fuses metal with hip-hop, rap, grunge, and sometimes groove and/or industrial received a fierce backlash after its rise to mainstream prominence, a prominence that lasted roughly from 1994 to 2005. In fact, after 2005, many nu metal bands altered their sounds to varying degrees of critical or commercial success, and nu metal groups and musicians often distanced themselves from the nu metal nomer, some even going as far as to deny that their music was ever nu metal to begin with, as if they were an angsty hat turned backwards St. Peter denying their support of nu metal Jesus thrice times over. If anything, nu metal just became synonymous with bad connotations for a while, just like Mel Gibson. Yet, unlike Mel Gibson, nu metal made a comeback, mostly through new up-and-coming bands who saw value in the nu metal sound and was thus influenced by it, millennial kids like myself who grew up listening to it, now becoming nostalgic adults who are now in the driver's seat when it comes to a lot of popular culture, God help us all, or even metal purists re-evaluating nu metal now that time has distanced the sour taste left in their mouth by all the shit bands in the genre, which is something that now allows them to appreciate the good nu metal bands, overall seeing the merits of the subgenre even despite the amount of god-awful bands in that said subgenre. Because to be clear, there were a lot of shit bands here. But even with that out of the way, regardless of where you once stood on nu metal, it is undeniable that nu metal back in its day did feature some standout acts and a more than fair share of exceptional albums, because despite some of the absolute garbage bands, no relation, the beleaguered nu metal subgenre still had a lot of classic material worth praising, because truly, there were plenty of certifiable bangers here. This brings us to Korn's self-titled debut, the 1994 music history game changer that is often regarded as one of the first nu metal albums. While sure, bands had fused hip-hop with metal and rock in the past, see Anthrax's crossover with Public Enemy on Bring the Noise, and bands like the funky rock group Faith No More, who essentially did whatever the they wanted because Mike Patton be Mike Patton, Korn's nearly 3-decade-old self-titled debut was a revelatory music experience that has honestly survived the passage of time, unlike Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. It's an album that, despite helping spawn the nu metal subgenre, and all the shit that entails, is overall still very good and proves that the nu metal subgenre, despite its inherent baggage, really did have a lot of creative merit. There was actually inherent value here. And admittedly, for a lot of people who aren't as familiar with metal or this subgenre, which might be a good amount of my audience who generally watch my videos for movie and video game takes, you might be wondering what makes Korn's self-titled debut different and better from the releases of other nu metal outfits. After all, like many nu metal experiences, Korn's debut has seemingly simplistic and stripped down guitar riffs and musicianship compared to more flashy and technical metal bands like, say, Slayer, Pantera, Iron Maiden, or Metallica, as well as very angsty vocals and lyrics with a lot of verbalized anger, F-bombs, and insults levied at other people who have wronged the lead singer. And for that, some might question why Korn's self-titled album succeeded where other albums and bands failed when there are some clear stylistic overlaps here. Y'all might wonder what makes this album, and by extension the band itself, good, whereas other albums and bands in this genre are less good. And to answer, the anger, emotional anguish, and musicianship on display in Korn's self-titled debut features vulnerability and authenticity, two traits that other nu metal bands sadly lack, because where many nu metal groups adopted tough guy personas that made their musicians look like grown-up man-children, Korn's rage was, well, vulnerable and authentic. It was relatable. Korn's self-titled debut's vulnerability and authenticity starts with the vocals by lead singer Jonathan Davis, and also kind of by understanding the song Blind, one of the band's biggest songs. See, in a 2020 interview with Louder Sound, where Davis helped break down his band's debut album track by track, Davis revealed that the lyrics behind Blind, the raging album opener that remains as one of Korn's biggest hits, was less about coherence and more a sort of stream of consciousness thing, meaning that this song's meaning reflected a certain emotional state that Jonathan Davis was in at the time, rather than an actual pre-constructed or pre-rehearsed meaning. It was just about the feels, and those feels describe Jonathan Davis's emotional state at the time, which was of someone dealing with intense post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and just an overall sense of emotional anguish, which were intense and distressing feelings that overall extended to the album as a whole. While yes, unlike Blind, most of the rest of the songs have more concrete lyrical ideas behind them, they are all still tonally and thematically in sync with one another. A lot of these songs are about alienation, how childhood trauma can with one's decision-making as an adult, how easily the innocence of youth can be corrupted, and such. Something that Jonathan Davis understands all too well. And be forewarned, and this kind of acts as a content warning for the rest of the video, this episode is about to get really dark for a moment. Like, we're about to dive into some really difficult childhood trauma, including the experience of abuse of a sexual kind. So if you're not really up to watch or listen to that right now, or if that is potentially triggering for you, just please hit pause and do something else for the time being, okay? You can always come back to this video when you are ready, I promise. Also, as an additional content warning, later on in this video, I will be discussing my own trauma with gender dysphoria as well. And if you also have gender dysphoria and are not in a good place to engage with content about that subject matter, you might also want to skip this video for now for that reason as well. Once again, you can come back to this video when you are ready, I promise. So with that warning out in the open, let's talk about Jonathan Davis and his past. See, even by the standards of a bad childhood, Davis had an especially rough upbringing. After all, Davis was regularly hospitalized and almost died from asthma attacks as a small child, was emotionally abused by his stepmother as a teenager to the point that he wanted to move out of the house. Davis was bullied at school and was often on the receiving end of many homophobic slurs due to how he dressed and acted more effeminately than others. Though to be clear, Jonathan Davis was not gay, he was just really into the new wave music genre and all the emphasis on fashion and makeup that entailed. And most horrifically, as a child, Davis was sexually abused by someone who was both a neighbor and a babysitter, and when Davis tried to tell his parents about it, the people that should have believed him unconditionally, they unfortunately didn't believe him and essentially ignored his confession. And holy shit, that is awful in a way that can't be put into words. Like, I'm not even gonna put a joke or a quip here. That might be one of the worst things that can happen to a child. It's beyond terrible. And look, I'm not saying this information to bring the mood down for the sake of documenting Davis's abuse. If anything, I believe that Jonathan Davis's life story is one of resiliency, seeing as he's still surviving, making music, and seems by all accounts to be a very likable guy. But I am talking about this very tough subject matter because it gives much needed context to Korn's music, and their first album in particular, which as stated before, works because this album sees its lead singer become vulnerable and espouse a pain and a rage that is very authentic, because through the lyricism and the vocal performance, you can clearly tell that Davis is channeling his pain and history with childhood trauma, i.e. that pain that made him the young man that he ultimately became at the time of recording of Korn's self-titled debut, into the music. If anything, most of the songs on the LP spawn from Davis's anguish in some way. Predictable and Lies are about bottling up negative emotions. Helmets in the Bush, nice title, is about Jonathan Davis having a drug problem, something that many people with trauma and mental health issues have as well. Need To and Divine revolve around Davis having mental health issues to the point that he either had trouble communicating with potential romantic interests or displayed toxic behavior of his own, because trauma can be cyclical. Chutes and Ladders takes old nursery rhymes with dark meanings and presents them in a very sinister light. Clown, and a song that is a homophobic slur that I will not say due to the fears that YouTube might strike my channel down, are about intolerance and bullying. And finally, there is the concluding track Daddy, which covers Davis being a victim of sexual assault as a child and how his parents ultimately did not believe him, as well as having some lyrics from the perspective of the perpetrator committing that aforementioned assault. A track that is especially dark. And with all of these songs, as well as a few that I did not cover, Korn's self-titled debut is a thematically grim record that comes from a very real place of pain. It is an intense experience. In fact, on this record, Jonathan Davis screams, cries, yells his frustrations with the world and the situations that it has put him in, and overall has this fittingly shaky voice that just feels burdened by pain. A voice that may prevent him from being technically the best nu metal singer, but one that still allows him to arguably be the most unique. If anything, as stated before, Davis's voice is just vulnerable and authentic on this LP. It's why Davis breaking down and crying at the end of Daddy, due to recounting his traumatic experiences on that song, hits the listener emotionally. It's why his screams on Blind have a human element behind the ferocity. It's why even some of the album's more juvenile, curse-ridden lyrics have teeth behind them, because on this record, and unlike other nu metal experiences with different lead singers who sound like whiny children pretending to be adults, Davis lashes out due to how he is in deep pain rather than as an effort to act tough. If anything, from his voice alone, you can tell that he's tormented, that he is hanging over the pit of existential despair by a single thread. If anything, his voice overall embodies the album's thematic purpose of how childhood trauma can be an unshakably painful influence that continues when those said children grow up and become adults, which is a very powerful theme. Hell, judging by how a lot of Korn's album covers feature children in dangerous or horrifying situations or childhood heirloom heirlooms corroding, this honestly feels like the band's overall mission statement, one that is ultimately perfectly established on Korn's self-titled debut in a way that is genuine and honest. Sure, Davis screaming "F you" and "I hate you" on some of the tracks might seem childish and juvenile, but for one thing, Davis and the rest of the musicians in Korn were in their early 20s when recording this album. They were roughly college-aged young adults, which if you are an actual adult like myself, then you know that college-age young adults are essentially adults on training wheels. If anything, a lot of angst is understandable here. And for another thing, this doesn't change the fact that the album talks about the very personal and figurative demons that haunt Jonathan Davis, meaning that some blunt lyrics really befit this LP's overall thesis, because lyrically speaking, Korn's self-titled debut strikes a resonant chord, one that, as stated earlier, sees Davis be vulnerable and authentic, because emotionally speaking, this album is the real deal. However, this is all before we get into the musicianship aside from the vocals as well, mostly because the riffs by Brian Welch, stage name Head, and James Christian Schaefer, stage name Monkey, bassist Reginald Quincy Arivzu, stage name Fieldy, and drummer David Silveria, no stage name, just David, all contribute to the self-titled album's sound and dark thematic core in a very complimentary way. Head's and Monkey's riffs are gnarly and often hit you over the head in a way that you just cannot help but bang your head to. Fieldy's groovy bass work really shines and can oftentimes establish a gothic tone, and Silveria's drumming really adds to the album's overall haunting atmosphere, meaning that when put together, the instrumental work adds to and really befits Jonathan Davis's vocal performance, where he sounds as if he's on the edge of a mental breakdown. If anything, there are many instances where some of the haunting musicianship just builds into a very macabre track, like in the songs Blind, Chutes and Ladders, and Daddy. It all just really works together here, and while sure, there may be some criticisms that the musicianship isn't that technically impressive, because unlike thrash metal or other genres, you won't hear any layered or detailed guitar solos, just heavy riffs that slap you across the face like a hammer, i.e. a hammer that is made out of the comparatively more stripped-back musicianship really befits the tone that self-titled tries and succeeds at striking. After all, anger and despair are very raw emotions. They aren't very complicated to understand, and given that, the riffs, bass, and drum work in self-titled are befittingly raw and angry to the point that it is very primal. If anything, the simplistic by choice instrumentals really get this emotional point across in a way that is, like Davis's lyricism and vocal performance, very vulnerable and authentic, because thematic synergy. Furthermore, the production by Ross Robinson was on point as well. Robinson, who is now often regarded as the godfather of nu metal due to how he had an uncanny ability to collect nu metal talent as if they were Infinity Stones, really got the most out of Korn's sound on self-titled. In fact, the riffs sound incredibly gnarly, like they are absolutely filthy in a way that really befits the raw negative energy that Korn is striving for here. Additionally, Robinson had some inspired spur-of-the-moment creative choices, the most notable of which was on the song Daddy. See, towards the end of that song, Jonathan Davis, who essentially just relived and recounted his childhood trauma of being sexually assaulted and the events following that, where his parents didn't believe him, breaks down crying and cursing the person who had traumatized him, which is a very grim and tough listening experience by design, because f***ing obviously. Yet instead of ending the song there, Robinson kept recording and instructed the band to keep playing, resulting in a track where the self-titled's lyrical themes of childhood trauma almost teeter to the point of going off the rails by Davis's understandable mental breakdown, but is instead still held together by the music. It actually works. And to make things even more impressive and dark, Davis, who was knee-deep in mental torment at the time, didn't realize the band was still recording, meaning that this mental breakdown, much like the rest of the album, saw Davis become vulnerable in a very authentic way, because thesis statement. Self-titled just has an unmistakable honesty to it. Korn's self-titled debut has left a legacy, and not just as an album that kickstarted the nu metal scene or launching the career of what would eventually become a high-profile metal act, but rather in how there's just so many people who still connect with the album on an emotional level, and one of those people be me. In fact, while re-listening to this album for this piece, I was struck by just how much I still related to it. While sure, I always relate to heavy metal riffs by default because I love being slapped across the face by some heavy riffs, but as someone who feels emotions on an intense level, because I be mentally ill, have OCD, and be bipolar, I just love the raw and angry riffs on this LP. I just really vibe with them. Furthermore, the lyrical content is relatable to me as well. Well, not about sexual assault, but the idea that childhood trauma can haunt someone as an adult. And honestly, I understand that all too well. As a transgender woman, I have PTSD due to experiencing the wrong puberty. And yes, PTSD is a thing that can happen in this scenario. While sure, some ignorant assholes might say that going through the wrong puberty is not really traumatic or whatever, my psychiatrist, therapist, and brain maps say different. So if you think you know better than documented proof and medical professionals, I encourage you to go choke on 12 dicks. But anyway, the point. I have PTSD. I remember how my body irreversibly changed into that of a man when what I really wanted was to be a woman. I had distressing thoughts and wondered why I couldn't just be like all the other girls. I dwelled on why I had to have this shit body and thus viewed being a girl as something that was off limits and unattainable to me. And for that, I hated myself and wondered why I had to be born different. I just became angry due to the burdensome amount of pain that I carried. I even stopped believing in Christianity because the concept of a God that lovingly created everyone made me hate the concept of God himself. Because if he really loved me and made everything the way in which was supposed to be, why did I have to be built in a way that caused me so much damn agony? Why did everything have to hurt so damn much? And given all these thoughts and background, trauma had done a number on me, which is ultimately why I really click with Korn's self-titled debut record. Because when Davis rages against the person that abused him on Daddy, I can see elements of myself. When Davis sings nursery rhymes accompanied by sinister guitar tones and chutes and ladders, I relate to the idea that childhood trauma can stick with kids long after they have grown up. When Davis broaches the topics on how he fails to handle certain social situations, my awkward as ass self could put myself into his shoes. And when Davis talks about being bullied and labeled as a homophobic slur in the song that is titled A Homophobic Slur, I felt seen. After all, I am LGBTQIA. As a kid and a teenager, I wasn't exactly always the manliest guy and got made fun of quite a bit due to the fact that I didn't always fit in with preconceived notions of masculinity. Because, you know, at the time, I thought it was totally normal for a guy to want to be a girl. These were just regular thoughts that bros have. I may have been in denial. So yeah, I just related to the venom that Davis was espousing in this track. And for that, I connect with a lot of self-titled songs on a personal level. I just really identified with the authentic and vulnerable pain present on this album. Ultimately, Korn's self-titled debut was the launching point for a legendary nu metal career. In fact, the band would release a second album that was just as dark, vulnerable, and honest in Life is Peachy, which is a good record, maybe not as good as the self-titled debut, but still strong. But with that said, the group eventually would successfully stretch their creative muscles with the following albums of Follow the Leader, Issues, and Untouchables. Untouchables honestly being my favorite Korn record. And on these LPs, Korn expanded their sound and threaded the needle when it came to having quality and crystal clear production, all while still having an appropriately grimy feel, which is a sound that overall got them bigger audiences, all while still being able to keep the fans of the band's first two records very happy, which is a happy medium for a band to be in. While sure, a song or two from this era have not aged well, chief among them the Follow the Leader track, All in the Family, a song that featured Limp Bizkit's Fred Durst on vocals, awful tough guy lyrics, even though not meant to be taken seriously because this is a joke song, a cavalier use of a homophobic slur as an insult because wow, the 90s were a fucking time, and was a song that was bad enough that Korn's Jonathan Davis wished that they never recorded it. The fact remains that the majority of Korn's music from this era still works. It still holds up. However, Korn's career was very hit or miss after that. The group had more than a few lineup changes and honestly had an identity crisis for a bit in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Like they tried to and didn't always succeed at being an alternative metal act on albums like See You on the Other Side and Untitled, though See You on the Other Side does have one of Korn's biggest hits in Coming Undone, so there is that, as well as Remember Who You Are, which really tried to recapture the filthy sound and thematically dark content of their earlier work, but overall just felt really forced, which is the opposite of the authenticity that the band usually portrays. And then there was the dubstep record. We will not talk about the dubstep record. So yeah, it wasn't always smooth sailing for the band, yet Korn were eventually able to creatively rebound. Starting in 2013, they released The Paradigm Shift, which was a solid comeback effort. 2016's Serenity of Suffering had some absolutely great tracks on it, and then finally 2019's The Nothing and 2022's Requiem are just legitimately really good Korn records that harken back to the quality of their first 5 albums, which if you follow the band, you know is a compliment. And Korn was able to pull this comeback back off due to how they returned to what worked for them earlier in their career, which is to say, quality production, creative riffs, even if not being the most technically impressive, and lyrics that see Davis being authentic and vulnerable. Maybe not as vulnerable as on their self-titled debut or even Life is Peachy, because, that wouldn't be a healthy mind state for anyone to be in forever, but rather vulnerable enough to give credence to the lyrical and thematic content of the music, a sincerity that has been proven to work for Korn since their debut album, because truly Korn's legendary self-titled record proved that music laced with candid honesty can resonate with listeners who also have gone through similar experiences, those who have experienced childhood trauma, bullying, or mental illnesses, and for many people struggling, that is a powerful statement, one that Korn presents on a lot of their records, both old and new. But given how self-titled was Korn's first attempt at this album overall should get the most credit, because overall Korn's self-titled debut's legacy goes beyond Korn as a band or how it helped establish a whole subgenre. No, it's about how so many people felt recognized by the album's dark and grim content. It's how so many listeners saw Korn's vulnerability through its authenticity, and that is ultimately the self-titled album's legacy.